Paul Bunyan was a maker, a carver of a new world. But some things cannot be made. Some things are simply sent.
We won't fight it, old friend. We'll give this winter a home. His strength had failed him, so he would have to use his will.
He couldn't destroy the winter, so he gave it a place to rest, and created the Great Lakes.
In a remote village tucked behind the endless pine forests of North America, dawn had only begun to stretch across the sky when something unusual shook the earth. At first, the villagers thought it was a small earthquake. Cups rattled on tables, leaves drifted from branches, and birds burst from the trees in startled swarms. But then came a sound deep, powerful, and chest-trembling, that made everyone freeze where they stood. It was a cry, not a human cry, not a normal one, at least. It echoed across the valley, like the roar of a glacier splitting apart. That was the morning Paul Bunyan was born. The Bunyan family lived in a modest cabin overlooking a wide meadow. But today, that cabin looked more like a shrinking box, struggling to contain its newest inhabitant. Paul Bunyan, even on the first day of his life, was no ordinary baby. He was as big as 6 grown men stacked on top of each other. His mother, Martha Bunyan, a gentlewoman with steady hands and unwavering patience, stared in awe at her child, astonished, yet filled with love. His father, Elias Bunyan, one of the strongest loggers in the region, could only stand speechless as the newborn flexed his massive fingers, each one thicker than a wagon wheel spoke. Every time Paul moved, the cabin creaked like an old ship fighting a storm. When he stretched, the floorboards groaned. When he rolled over, the walls bowed outward until they looked ready to burst. Curious townsfolk crept toward the cabin, peeking in through the window, only to stumble back the moment they saw a baby's head the size of a barrel. "Good heavens," whispered an elder. "That's not a child, that's a sign." Whether of fortune or misfortune, time will tell. Within hours, word of Paul's birth spread beyond the village, faster than rumors of an approaching storm. People traveled from miles away to witness the giant infant. Some brought small offerings. Others brought prayers, frightened that a baby of such size might bring disaster simply by breathing. But Martha held Paul with the tenderness of any mother. She stroked his enormous head, and instantly his thunderous crying stopped. Nevertheless, a new challenge arose. Paul simply could not live in an ordinary home. On his first day, he reached for the chimney as though it were a toy block and snapped it clean off. On the second day, he crawled across the floor and left a trail of broken boards in his wake, sending chickens scattering from the wreckage. On the third day, he rolled out of bed and cracked half the cabin wall. Elias Bunyan, sturdy and determined, made a decision no father had ever had to make: to build a cradle fit for a giant. With the help of neighboring loggers, he ventured deep into the forest and felled the largest tree they could find. They carved its trunk into the shape of an enormous cradle, wide enough for 10 ordinary babies and long enough for Paul's still-growing legs. But even that wasn't enough. When Paul stretched in his sleep, the cradle rocked violently, swaying like a ship tossed by stormy seas. Yet there was something magical about the child. For all his size and strength, Paul was cheerful. He giggled whenever the wind brushed across the meadow, and his laughter deep and booming sent puffs of clouds drifting through the sky. When he slapped his hand against the ground, he accidentally created shallow pits that filled with rainwater, becoming little lakes that the local children would later use for swimming. One particularly cold night, under the glow of a pale moon, something remarkable happened. Awakened by the hoot of an owl, Paul lifted himself out of his giant cradle and crawled across the field. The earth trembled under his weight. Houses shook. Villagers woke in panic and ran outside, convinced a massive quake was tearing through the land. But instead, they found a giant baby sitting calmly in the meadow, staring at the moon with wide, fascinated eyes. The village elder, once fearful, approached slowly. "He means no harm," the elder whispered. "He is simply too big for a world too small." After that night, everything changed. The villagers stopped blaming the child for the unintentional damage he caused. They reinforced their homes, learned to live with the gentle tremors of Paul's movements, and even began to adapt the landscape to accommodate him. Some saw him as a blessing and omen that their village would one day be the birthplace of legend. And they were right. No one could yet imagine that the child who brought tremors with every giggle would grow up to be the greatest, kindest lumberjack the world had ever known. But for now, Paul Bunyan remained just a baby, an enormous, wondrous baby sleeping peacefully beneath the moonlight, his soft breaths rustling the treetops like a passing breeze. As the months passed, the village gradually adjusted to life beside a growing giant. What had once been fear and uncertainty slowly transformed into curious admiration. For although Paul Bunyan grew faster than any creature on earth, he remained gentle, warm-hearted, and endlessly fascinated by the world around him. By the time Paul reached the age of 1, he was as tall as a fully grown pine tree. His cheerful steps, each one large enough to flatten a wagon, became part of the village's rhythm. Whenever Paul woke up early and toddled through the meadow, the villagers would brace themselves, holding plates and cups so they wouldn't rattle off shelves. But they laughed about it now. Life with Paul was unpredictable, but it was never sad. One of the first signs that Paul's childhood would be unlike any other came on a windy autumn morning. Paul, still barely speaking, waddled outside to follow a drifting leaf. Each step left a footprint so deep that rainwater collected inside, forming tiny ponds. Children later played in those ponds as though they were little swimming holes. Paul clapped joyfully when he saw them splashing, his laughter echoing through the valley like distant thunder. His strength, however, was something beyond comprehension. When he was only 2, he accidentally tugged a tree from its roots while trying to steady himself. Elias Bunyan, who had spent his whole life chopping trees, stood in stunned silence as his toddler lifted the pine like a twig. Fearing Paul might panic, Elias expected tears, but Paul instead swung the tree around playfully, as though it were a giant toy. "Easy there, son," Elias shouted, running after him. But Paul only giggled and plopped the tree back into the ground. Miraculously, it stood upright, though crooked and confused. Martha Bunyan, far from being overwhelmed, adapted in her own creative ways. She stitched clothes for Paul from stitched-together wagon covers, quilted blankets from sails borrowed off ships, and baked loaves of bread the size of hay bales to keep him full. The villagers joked that Martha could single-handedly clothe a mountain if she needed to. But even with all the effort, raising Paul was not easy. His appetite was legendary. Rumor says that once, during a growth spurt, he ate 40 baskets of apples in a single afternoon. Another time, he drank from the village well and emptied half of it in one gulp. The villagers quickly learned that when Paul was thirsty, they needed to guide him to a nearby lake instead. Fortunately, Paul was clever as well as strong. Before the age of 3, he could already help with farm chores, though sometimes his help caused more work. Once, seeing a farmer struggle to plow a field, Paul decided to help by dragging the entire plow behind him. By the time someone reached him to shout for him to stop, Paul had already plowed the whole valley, uprooting fences, barns, and the farmer's entire potato patch along the way. "Sorry," Paul mumbled, looking ashamed. But the farmer burst out laughing instead. "Best harvest I'll ever have." "Don't worry, lad." Paul's heart was as big as his body. Whenever he made a mistake, he tried to fix it. And whenever he saw someone in need, he rushed to help, even if his help was sometimes a bit too enthusiastic. The villagers learned to give him tasks that suited his size, carrying heavy lumber, lifting boulders, or clearing fallen trees after storms. As Paul grew older, he became more adventurous. He loved climbing hills, though each climb often resulted in new landslides and valleys, unintentionally formed by his massive hands and feet. On one memorable day, Paul discovered that he loved skipping stones across lakes. What seemed harmless to him became a spectacle for the entire village. Each stone he tossed was the size of a millstone, and when they hit the water, they created waves that sloshed over the banks, drenching everyone nearby. Still, Paul remained everyone's favorite giant, but despite his size, Paul often felt lonely. He towered above everyone, and no matter how friendly the villagers were, he couldn't play with children his age without fearing he might hurt them. He tried his best to be gentle, tiptoeing carefully through the village, lowering his voice to a whisper when he spoke, and folding himself onto the ground when he wanted to listen to stories. Yet he longed for a companion who could run beside him without fear, someone who wouldn't tremble every time he laughed. That wish began to grow in Paul's heart like a slow, quiet ache. Then came the winter that changed everything. Snow piled higher than rooftops, and fierce winds howled through the village. Even Paul shivered in the cold, though his body was sturdier than any human's. One morning, after a night of blizzards, Paul wandered into the forest to find firewood for his mother. It was there, beneath a blanket of frost, that he found something that would alter his life forever. At first he thought it was a small snowdrift, but as he brushed away the ice, he discovered a calf frozen blue from the cold, barely breathing. Paul gently cradled the creature in his enormous hands, shielding it from the wind with his own body. He carried it home, warmed it by the fire, and refused to leave its side until it opened its eyes. The moment those bright blue eyes blinked up at him, Paul felt something stir inside him: joy, belonging, friendship. He named the calf Babe, and from that day on, Paul would never be lonely again. The winter that brought Paul and the calf together was unlike anything the villagers had ever seen. For weeks, snow hammered the land with merciless cold, burying barns, silencing rivers, and turning the forest into a frozen maze of white. Even Paul, who could shrug off storms that would terrify ordinary men, felt the sting of frost on his massive shoulders, but nothing worried him more than the fragile calf he had rescued from the icy woods. For hours after carrying the trembling creature home, Paul sat beside the village's largest bonfire, an enormous blaze built specifically to warm him and his new companion. Martha Bunyan wrapped the calf in layers of cloth stitched from burlap sacks, while Elias fed the fire with logs the size of small trees. Slowly, the calf's breathing steadied. Its blue-tinted coat, which at first Paul thought was just frostbite, remained blue even as the warmth returned to its body. When it finally opened its eyes, two bright sapphires, shimmering with life, Paul gasped in awe. "You're blue," he whispered, his voice softer than a breeze. The calf lifted its head weakly and let out a tiny, trembling moo. From that moment, Paul knew the creature wasn't ordinary. It was as if the winter storm had shaped it from ice and sky, giving it that magical blue sheen. The villagers gathered around, equally fascinated and bewildered. Some claimed the calf was a guardian spirit. Others insisted it was a sign of good fortune sent from the heavens. Whatever the truth, there was no denying the bond forming between Paul and the calf. Paul named him Babe, and Babe accepted the name with a gentle nuzzle against Paul's arm, though Paul's arm was large enough to be mistaken for a tree trunk. Babe's first days: at first, Babe was unable to stand. The storm had drained all strength from its body, so Paul tended to him day and night. He fed him warm milk from a barrel-sized bucket, dried his coat with blankets the size of sails, and sang soft lullabies, his deep voice vibrating through the cabin like a comforting drum. Babe responded quickly. Within days, he could walk, though he wobbled like a newborn fawn. Within weeks, he followed Paul everywhere, sometimes slipping on the ice, other times using Paul's leg as support. Paul, who had grown used to towering over everything, found himself bending down constantly to check on Babe. It was the first time he felt responsible for another being who saw him not as a giant, but as a friend. The villagers admired their growing friendship. Every morning, they saw Paul climbing out of his oversized shelter with Babe trotting faithfully behind him, leaving twin trails in the snow. One massive, one tiny, both side by side. But then something miraculous happened. The blue ox's growth, just as Paul had grown impossibly fast as a child, Babe began to grow at an astonishing rate. Each morning, Martha noticed Babe's head rising higher. Each evening, Elias measured Babe against the fence and, each evening, Babe was taller. By the end of winter, the calf was already larger than any ox the villagers had ever seen. Yet Babe was gentle, playful, and loyal. When the snow melted, Paul took him out to the meadow to explore the world beyond the village. The first time Babe saw his reflection in a half-thawed pond, he jumped in surprise, splashing Paul with icy water. Paul laughed, a booming sound that scattered birds from the trees, and Babe responded by rubbing his head against Paul's chest. It became clear that Babe thought Paul was his family, and Paul felt the same. They were inseparable. The first adventures together. By the time spring returned, Babe had grown taller than the barn. He was still gaining strength, still learning his own limits and occasionally forgetting them. More than once, he sneezed so powerfully that he blew snow off rooftops or toppled nearby fences. Paul found these mishaps hilarious. The villagers learned to take them in stride. Paul and Babe spent their days wandering the forests and hills. Babe loved to tug on fallen logs, sometimes pulling entire tree trunks behind him as if they were twigs. Paul encouraged him, teaching Babe how to use his strength gently so he wouldn't damage the forest or hurt the smaller creatures living within it. Sometimes they played games that no ordinary child or animal could ever attempt. They skipped boulders across frozen lakes, raced through valleys, and created trails so wide that new streams began forming through the melted snow. Wherever they went, the landscape shifted, softly molded by the footsteps of the giant boy and his blue companion. But for Paul, the best part wasn't the games or the excitement. It was the companionship. For the first time in his life, he had someone who walked with him without fear. Someone who could withstand his laughter, his energy, his sighs. Someone who matched him not perfectly, but closely enough to fill the loneliness he felt, since he was old enough to notice the distance between himself and the rest of the world. Babe filled that empty space. Babe made Paul feel whole. A bond forged in winter. One chilly spring evening, as Paul sat on a hillside watching the sunset, Babe rested beside him, laying his massive blue head on Paul's lap. The sky above them blazed with reds and golds, mirrored in the sheen of Babe's unusual coat. The wind whispered through the pines, and for a moment, the entire world felt quiet. "Babe," Paul murmured, stroking his friend's warm neck, "I think we're meant to stick together. You and me. Always." Babe let out a soft, contented moo. It was an agreement, a promise, a beginning. Little did they know that their friendship, the bond between a giant and a blue ox, would one day grow strong enough to reshape the world around them. Rivers, forests, mountains, and lakes would all bear the mark of their adventures. But for now, they were just two extraordinary beings, sitting under a colorful sky, ready to face whatever awaited them next. Together. Spring settled over the land like a warm blanket, melting the last traces of the brutal winter that had brought Paul and Babe together. With every new sunrise, their bond grew stronger, so strong that the villagers often joked. Paul and Babe breathed in the same rhythm. Wherever Paul went, Babe followed. Wherever Babe wandered, Paul was never far behind. It was a friendship so natural, so effortless, that it seemed destined long before they ever met. By now Babe had grown into a magnificent blue ox, his coat shimmering like morning frost under the sun. His size rivaled that of Paul himself. Though Babe was shorter, he was undeniably powerful. When they stood side by side, they looked like two enormous forces of nature, inseparable and unstoppable. Yet, despite their strength, the heart of their companionship was something simple and tender: trust. Always side by side every morning, Paul and Babe began their day with a stroll across the meadow. Paul's steps made wide, deep impressions in the earth, while Babe's hooves added rounded prints beside them. The villagers loved waking up to these twin trails, living proof that the giant boy and the blue ox were still guarding the valley. Children would gather at a safe distance to watch them pass. Babe often snorted playfully, blowing gusts of warm air strong enough to ruffle the children's hair. Paul, amused, would gently wave, lowering his voice so his greeting didn't shake the rooftops. The villagers trusted Paul, but they also trusted Babe. The ox was enormous, but gentle, powerful but calm, loyal but never threatening. When storms approached, Babe could sense them before any human. He'd moo softly, warning the villagers to secure their homes. And when thunder split the sky, Babe would stand beside Paul, both of them watching the lightning with serene confidence. Together, they made the valley feel safe. Learning each other's strengths, though their friendship seemed effortless, Paul and Babe spent many days learning how to work as a team. Paul had grown used to his own strength, but working with another giant creature required new kinds of understanding. When Paul tried to pull a fallen tree trunk, Babe insisted on helping even if Paul could easily do it alone. Babe would tug from one side while Paul guided from the other, and together they made the work smoother, faster, and surprisingly fun. Occasionally, their enthusiasm caused complications. Once, Paul asked Babe to help clear a cluster of dead trees. Babe lowered his head, nudged the trunks, and pushed a little too hard. The trees toppled one after another in a perfect line right into the frozen creek. The entire thing dammed the water instantly, causing a brand new pond to form. Paul blinked, then burst into laughter that echoed across the hills. "Well, Babe," he said, patting his friend, "you just made the village a new fishing spot." Babe mooed proudly, as though he'd planned it that way all along. In time, they developed silent signals. A stump of Paul's foot, a shake of Babe's head, a wave of Paul's hand, or a soft snort from Babe. These simple gestures were enough for them to understand each other perfectly. They didn't just communicate, they connected. Adventures that shaped the land, with spring fading into early summer, Paul and Babe began exploring farther from the village. They crossed hills, valleys, and forests, discovering new parts of the wilderness that no human had ever seen. One day, Paul and Babe wandered into a vast stretch of forest where the trees grew so tall they disappeared into the clouds. Paul pressed his palm against one of the trunks, amazed. Babe sniffed the air, ears twitching at the sound of distant waterfalls. As they explored, their movements unintentionally reshaped the land. Paul stepped into soft soil, and the ground caved under his weight, forming wide, shallow lakes. Babe scraped his hooves along the earth, carving what would become winding riverbeds. Birds followed them, nesting in the massive footprints Paul left behind. Gradually, the wilderness adapted to their presence, welcoming them, shaping itself around them. To later generations, these unusual land formations would become mysteries. Some would say nature made them, others would whisper legends. But only Paul and Babe knew the truth. They were footprints of friendship, a bond tested. Not every day was bright and warm. There were storms, wild winds, and moments that tested their friendship. Once, in the heat of early summer, a wildfire erupted deep in the forest. The villagers panicked as flames raced toward the valley, devouring trees faster than anyone could fight. Paul didn't hesitate. He and Babe charged toward the blaze. Working together, they created a firebreak. Paul stomped out flames with his massive boots, while Babe used his enormous strength to push burning logs aside. At one point, a flaming tree nearly fell onto Babe. Paul dove forward and caught it, throwing it aside with a strength fueled by fear for his friend. Babe, panting and covered in soot, mooed gratefully and nuzzled Paul's shoulder. After hours of work, they contained the fire. The villagers welcomed them back with cheers, tears, and open arms. But Paul wasn't thinking about praise. He sat beside Babe, resting his forehead against the ox's horn. "Don't scare me like that again," he whispered. Babe responded with a soft, apologetic rumble. Their bond already strong became unbreakable. Two souls, one path. By the end of summer, the villagers realized something profound. Paul and Babe didn't just share a friendship, they shared a purpose. Together, they protected the land, helped the people, and shaped the world around them in ways no one else could. Sitting atop a hill one evening, Paul watched the sun dip below the horizon. Babe lay beside him, breathing slow and steady. "Babe," Paul murmured, "I think the world's a lot bigger than our valley. I think it's time we see it. Together." Babe lifted his head, eyes glimmering with the fading light. A soft moo, a nod, a promise. They were ready. The world awaited the giant and the blue ox-dew friends, bound not by size or strength, but by a loyalty deeper than rivers and older than mountains. Their journey was about to begin. The morning after Paul and Babe finished clearing the path for the loggers, the forest awoke to an unusual silence. Birds perched on branches that no longer swayed because the trees around them had been rearranged, sometimes neatly, sometimes in the chaotic patterns typical of a giant, and his enormous blue ox, learning to work in harmony. Paul stood at the edge of the vast woodland, hands on his hips, surveying the wilderness that stretched like an endless green sea before him. Babe, towering beside him, snorted, sending a small hurricane of pine needles swirling through the air. "Looks like we've got work to do, buddy," Paul said with a grin. Babe responded with a deep, rumbling moo that made the earth beneath them tremble. The logging camps scattered across the frontier were desperate. The settlers who had traveled thousands of miles needed homes, warm, sturdy ones that could survive brutal winters, wolves, storms, and everything else the frontier threw at them. And while ordinary lumberjacks were strong, determined, and courageous, none of them could carve out land fast enough to keep up with the growing number of pioneers. That was why Paul had come. He wasn't just clearing forests anymore. He was shaping land for families, for towns, for futures. Paul's first step was simple. Open enough forest to build roads and homes. But simple, for Paul Bunyan, never looked simple to anyone else. With his colossal axe in hand, he walked into the thickest part of the woods. Each swing produced the thunder of a falling oak. Trees toppled as if bowing before him, creating pathways wide enough for entire wagon caravans to pass side by side. Babe worked beside him, pulling out stubborn tree stumps with a flick of his horn, or dragging away massive logs that would have taken a dozen teams of horses to budge. Soon, they were moving in perfect rhythm, pole cutting. Babe clearing, the two of them transforming the wilderness into something livable. Word traveled fast. Settlers gathered on hillsides to watch the spectacle. An enormous man and his gleaming blue ox, reshaping the frontier as though they were playing in an oversized sandbox. Children cheered whenever Babe shook snow off his back, sending flurries drifting down like a winter storm. Women and men stared in awe as Paul stacked logs into neat piles that looked like walls, already half built. But the frontier was rarely cooperative. Nature always pushed back. One afternoon, as Paul and Babe were working near a particularly dense patch of forest, the sky darkened. Winds whipped through the trees, bending trunks like reeds. A storm unlike any the settlers had ever seen began to brew, furious, wild, almost alive. The gusts grew so strong that even Babe dug his hooves into the ground to keep from being blown off balance. Paul squinted up at the swirling clouds. "Looks like the forest is fighting back," he muttered. And fight back it did. The winds ripped branches from trees and hurled them like javelins. The ground trembled as lightning cracked open the sky. Settlers scrambled to shelter, terrified the storm would undo all the work Paul and Babe had accomplished. But Paul didn't back down. He lifted his massive axe, bracing himself against the storm's fury. When the wind pushed him, he pushed back harder. Babe lowered his head, using his sheer bulk to block the worst of the gale from knocking Paul off balance. Together, they stood their ground. With each swing of Paul's axe, the storm weakened. Trees fell in surrender, and the wild winds slowly lost their strength. Babe stomped his hooves, sending rippling vibrations through the earth, shaking the storm into retreat. When the final gust sighed through the treetops and faded, the settlers emerged to find the forest, not destroyed, but beautifully opened, ready for homes. That storm would be remembered for generations as the day the wind challenged Paul Bunyan. As soon as the skies cleared, Paul began organizing the timber. He stacked logs in straight rows, leaving wide spaces between them, spaces that would become roads, town squares, and gathering places. Babe helped drag entire bundles of lumber to designated areas where the settlers could begin raising houses. Soon, the bare patch of forest began to take shape. Smoke curled from the first chimneys. Children played in the open fields Paul had carved. Families began planting gardens, building fences, and setting up shops. A town was forming, one that would not have existed without Paul's enormous hands and Babe's mighty hooves. Paul watched from a distance, exhausted but satisfied. Babe nudged him gently, as if reminding him that their work had only just begun. "Yeah, I know," Paul said, patting Babe's massive forehead. "There's a whole lot more frontier out there." The settlers named the new town Bunyansville, in honor of the giant who had given them a place to call home. And as the sun dipped behind the newly cleared horizon, Paul and Babe set off again to the deeper forests, toward the next challenge the wilderness would throw at them. Their legend was only growing. With Bunyansville standing proud, behind them chimneys, smoking, children laughing, and settlers finally resting in homes, they long dreamed of Paul, and Babe continued deeper into the frontier. The forest seemed endless, stretching out like an unbroken sea of green, but the settlers needed more than open land. As their numbers grew, so did their needs: fresh water, fertile soil, and a reliable source of transport for lumber and goods. Paul had been thinking about that for days. Every night, he'd sit atop a boulder the size of a barn, his boots dangling off the edge, as though he were perched on a simple wooden stool. Babe would lie beside him, exhaling warm clouds of breath into the cool air. "Frontier's getting crowded," Paul murmured one evening. "These folks need water. Big water. Something that can serve for generations." Babe moved thoughtfully, as if in agreement. His breath rolled across the ground like fog. That idea grew in Paul's mind until it became too large to ignore. The settlers needed lakes, huge ones, capable of supporting entire communities. Lakes big enough to hold storms, reflect the skies, and feed rivers that wound across the continent. So the next morning, Paul tightened the straps on his massive boots, slung his axe over his shoulder, and headed north with Babe trotting beside him. They marched for days, through thick woods and marshes, until they reached a stretch of land so wide and flat, it looked like it had been waiting for something monumental. "This is the spot," Paul declared. Babe let out a low bellow, his tail swishing as if he could already sense what was about to happen. Paul dug his heels into the earth and raised his axe, not to cut trees this time, but to carve the land itself. With a single mighty swing, he split open a fissure in the soil. The ground rumbled like a waking beast. Dirt flew skyward, forming clouds of dust that danced with sunlight. Paul swung again and again, each strike gouging deeper and wider trenches. The settlers who had followed them out of curiosity stood on distant ridges, their jaws slack, watching Paul Bunyan reshape the land as though he were sculpting a monument from clay. Children clung to their parents' legs. The braver ones climbed onto rocks for a better view. Meanwhile, Babe joined in with all the enthusiasm of a giant blue ox who loved a good day's work. He lowered his formidable horns and dragged them across the ground, carving out the curves that would one day cradle vast expanses of water. When he stomped his massive hooves, the vibrations hollowed out the earth even further. Together they worked with almost artistic precision, Paul shaping the basins, Babe smoothing the edges, both of them crafting valleys so deep that echoes took longer to climb back to the surface. But nature, as always, did not accept defeat quietly. One night, a freezing northern wind swept through the landscape. Snow fell in wild swirling sheets. Temperatures plummeted. Paul and Babe awoke to find the massive pits they'd carved coated in a layer of frost so thick it gleamed like diamond. Even Paul's breath came out in crystallized puffs. "Well, that's gonna slow things down," Paul muttered. Babe stomped impatiently, cracking the frozen ground. But the ice kept reforming as quickly as he shattered it. Paul thought for a long moment, then grinned. "Guess we'll just have to make the sun work harder." He climbed the highest hill for miles around, reached up with both hands, and tilted the horizon just enough to bring more sunlight into the region. The settlers, watching from afar, couldn't believe their eyes. A shift so slight, yet so powerful, warmed the land, melted the frost, and softened the soil until the ground became workable again. With renewed energy, Paul and Babe returned to their monumental task. When the final basin was carved massive, shimmering, and ready, Paul called upon the rivers. He stomped once, hard, and the earth cracked open, releasing streams that flowed eagerly into the waiting hollows. Babe kicked open channels from distant waterways, guiding the currents like an ox-shaped river engineer. Water rushed in with a roar that echoed for miles. The depressions filled slowly at first, then with gathering speed. Lakes formed huge, deep, magnificent. Reflections of the sky shimmered on their surfaces. Waves lapped at their edges. Birds circled overhead, attracted by the sudden abundance of water. When the sun rose the next morning, it revealed a chain of shining new bodies of water, so vast they seemed to touch the horizon. The settlers were speechless. Rivers fed into the lakes, and new life bloomed along their shores. Fish darted through the crystal water. Trees grew stronger in the newly nourished soil. Paul stood at the edge of one of the lakes, hands on his hips. Babe stood beside him, dipping a hoof into the cool water. "Think that'll do?" Paul asked. Babe let out a soft, satisfied moo. Those lakes would later be known across America as the Great Lakes, though few would ever know that a giant lumberjack and his colossal blue ox had carved them by hand. But to the settlers who had witnessed it, those who saw Paul swing his axe into the earth, and watched Babe pull rivers into the waiting basins. The truth was unforgettable. Paul and Babe had not just changed the land. They had changed the destiny of the entire frontier. The Great Lakes shimmered like enormous mirrors beneath the morning sun, their surfaces calm, stretching wide as though the earth itself had paused to admire Paul Bunyan's handiwork. Settlers gathered along the shores fishing, washing, exploring the new waters that had transformed their frontier lives. The lakes brought trade, food, and hope. Entire communities began flourishing along their boundaries. Paul and Babe watched it all with quiet pride. Babe dipped his nose into Lake Superior, snorting at the cold water. Paul laughed, patting the ox's massive neck. "Cold enough to wake ya up, huh?" Their peace, however, was short-lived. Days later, the sky so often a vast blue dome darkened, in a way Paul had never seen before. Clouds the size of mountain ranges rolled in from the north. They weren't like ordinary storm clouds. These moved with intention, rumbling like a living creature. Settlers hurried inside, their faces pale as thunder cracked like cannon fire across the frontier. Paul narrowed his eyes toward the horizon. Something in the pit of his stomach turned heavy. "This ain't no regular storm, Babe." Babe's ears flattened. A low, uneasy bellow rumbled from his chest. Then, without warning, the first gust hit. It wasn't wind, at least, not the kind humans knew. It was a wall of force, powerful enough to rip full-grown trees from the ground and send them tumbling across the plains like twigs. Waves rose on the lakes, towering like liquid mountains, crashing onto the shore with a roar that shook the ground beneath Paul's feet. The settlers screamed as roofs ripped away and wagons skidded across the earth. The storm was a titan, using the Great Lakes as its own colossal drum, pounding the land with relentless fury. Paul planted his feet and braced himself. Babe stood at his side, the blue ox lowering his head, horns angled forward like a warrior preparing for battle. "This storm wants the lakes back," Paul murmured. "Wants the land the way it was. But we ain't giving up." The wind howled in response, almost as if it understood him. Then it struck again harder. A spiral of black clouds twisted downwards, forming a vortex so massive that it touched both heaven and earth. It lumbered across the landscape, dragging everything into its swirling maw. The lakes churned violently, threatening to spill over entirely. Paul lifted his axe, gripping it with both hands. Even for him, standing against a storm this size was like trying to hold back an ocean with his bare palms. But Paul Bunyan was never one to back down. "Come on, Babe. Let's show this storm what frontier folk are made of." Babe charged forward first, hooves pounding against the trembling ground. He leaped into the path of the cyclone, his huge body anchoring itself against the gravitational pull. The storm tugged at him, trying to lift him, but Babe dug his hooves deep enough to carve trenches in the soil. Paul swung his axe at the winds. The blade cut through the air with a booming crack, splitting gusts apart like firewood. Each strike weakened the cyclone's pull, but only slightly. The storm was ancient, wild, and furious, a giant of the sky challenging a giant of the earth. Lightning flashed, forked, and snapped across the heavens. Thunder rolled in deafening waves. Rain hit like falling stones. Trees bent backward. Boulders rolled uphill. Still, Paul fought. Still, Babe held his ground. But the storm wasn't done yet. A colossal wave rose from Lake Superior, so tall it blocked out the sun. It curled forward, threatening to crush the shoreline and everything on it. Settlers screamed from behind their doors as the shadow of the wave fell upon them. Paul whipped around, eyes wide. "Babe." Babe answered with a roar of a moo and charged to the lake's edge. As the wave came crashing down, Babe lowered his head and slammed his horns straight into it. Water exploded in all directions, breaking apart like glass against stone. The lake trembled, reshaping itself from the force of the impact. Paul used the moment to dig his boots into the earth. He inhaled a deep breath that seemed to draw in all the power of the land, and then he swung his axe with every ounce of strength he possessed. The blade sliced into the heart of the cyclone. A blinding burst of light ripped through the sky. The spiral shuddered, staggered, and began unraveling. Wind screamed as the storm lost its grip, its swirling mass breaking apart into smaller currents that scattered across the horizon. The giant storm roared one final time, then dissolved. Silence followed, a heavy quiet filled only by the dripping of rainwater and the distant call of a lone bird testing the air. Paul stood hunched, exhausted, his chest rising and falling like bellows. Babe leaned against him, his massive form trembling slightly from the effort. But they were alive, and more importantly, the people were safe. One by one, settlers emerged from their homes. They saw Paul and Babe standing on the shore, battered but victorious. Tears of relief mingled with cheers of pure gratitude. Children ran to the edge of the lake, shouting, "Paul saved us." Others cried, and Babe too. Paul wiped his brow and chuckled softly. "Reckon that storm think twice before coming back." Babe nudged him, almost playfully. The Great Lakes calmed, their vast surfaces settling into gentle ripples. The storm had tried to reclaim what Paul and Babe had created, but the frontier now belonged to its people, and to the giants who protected them. And though weary, Paul knew the storm's challenge had changed something in him. The land had more tests ahead, more wildness waiting to be tamed. He looked across the vast waters and whispered, "What's next, frontier?" The horizon remained quiet, but hungry for adventure. The storm had passed, but its memory lingered etched into the minds of settlers and woven into the very shape of the land. The Great Lakes shimmered quietly once more, as though nothing had happened, though everyone knew better. Paul Bunyan and Babe had stood toe-to-toe with one of the fiercest tempests the frontier had ever produced, and their victory only deepened their legend. But victory often brings new questions. In the days following the storm, travelers arrived from distant towns with strange stories. They spoke of a forest vast, ancient, and brimming with towering trees that had simply vanished. According to the settlers, the forest had stood strong for centuries, even before the first pioneers had ventured west. Now, it was gone. At first Paul assumed it was storm damage. Perhaps the giant cyclone had uprooted trees and scattered them. But the stories didn't match that theory. Travelers insisted the land wasn't damaged. Instead, the forest had disappeared cleanly, leaving behind a smooth stretch of empty ground, as though the trees had walked away. Paul didn't like mysteries, not the kind that involved the land. Every part of the frontier had a story, a history carved into bark and riverbeds, and he respected those stories. A missing forest was a wound on the land, one he felt responsible for understanding. "Babe," he said one morning, as they stood on a ridge overlooking Lake Superior, "reckon we should take a look." Babe gave a firm nod, part agreement, part warning. He had sensed the change too. The air was different, carrying a strange stillness. So they set off. They traveled east into the hills, following trails left behind by frightened settlers. The deeper they went, the stranger the land felt. Birds were quiet. The usual rustling of small woodland creatures had faded. Even the wind seemed to avoid the area, slipping silently around the treetops. When they finally reached the place where the forest had once stood, Paul stopped dead in his tracks. The stories had not exaggerated. Before them stretched a vast, barren plain smooth as riverstone, without a single tree stump or root. It was not destruction. It was absence. As if an entire forest had been plucked clean out of the earth. Paul kneeled down and scooped a handful of soil. It was cold, not frost cold, but hollow cold, like the chill that comes from a deep cave. He frowned. "This ain't natural," he muttered. Babe sniffed the air nervously, his tail swishing. His hooves shifted on the ground, scraping deeper into the earth. After a moment, Babe let out a low, uneasy rumble. Paul nodded. "I know, buddy. Something's wrong here." He walked to the center of the plain and discovered something remarkable. Faint grooves. Circular and perfectly carved, spiraling outward like giant fingerprints pressed into the ground. He traced them with his hands, smooth, untouched by tools or storms. A shiver ran down his spine. The land had moved, but not by human hands. As Paul studied the strange markings, the ground trembled not violently, but subtly, like a creature stirring in its sleep. Babe tensed, lowering his head. Then, far beneath their feet, a deep rumble echoed, rising from the earth's hidden chambers. Paul straightened slowly. "Forest didn't disappear," he whispered. "It sunk." He took a few steps back and knocked his knuckles against the ground. The sound wasn't solid. It rang hollow like knocking on a wooden barrel. Whatever had swallowed the forest was still down there. But before Paul could inspect further, a a sudden gust of icy wind swept across the plain. It moved unnaturally, circling them like a living thing. Paul's beard rippled. Babe dug in his hooves, resisting the pull. The wind condensed into a swirling shape, a silhouette of branches and roots before dissolving again into nothingness. Paul's voice dropped low. A spirit of the forest. He'd heard tales pass by, indigenous tribe stories about ancient guardians of the land who could move forests, reshape rivers, or swallow mountains when the balance of nature was disturbed. And Paul knew the storm he'd defeated hadn't been just a storm. It had been part of that balance. "Reckon the land's reclaimin' what it lost," he said quietly. Babe nudged Paul, urging him to stay alert. They followed the hollow vibrations across the plain. As they walked, the ground pulsed like a heartbeat. Soon, Paul noticed thin cracks forming ahead of them, spreading, branching, widening. Then came a distant groan from beneath the earth. Paul froze. Babe snorted nervously. The land opened. It didn't shatter or explode. It peeled, splitting into enormous plates that lifted on invisible hinges. Beneath them, far below, Paul glimpsed something astonishing, a forest alive, thriving, rooted deep underground. Trees taller than anything on the surface, leaves glowing faintly like bioluminescent lanterns. A hidden world. He stared into the subterranean expanse, filled with awe rather than fear. This was no destruction. It was protection. The earth had shielded an ancient forest from the monstrous storm. Slowly, the plates of land shifted again, closing the gap. Paul stood silently after the ground sealed, his mind turning. "So the forest hid itself," he murmured, "protecting its heartwood." Babe exhaled a soft, almost relieved moo. Paul placed his palm on the earth. "You did what you had to, big fella," he whispered, not to Babe, but to the land itself. After a long moment, the ground grew still, its heartbeat fading into the natural rhythm of the frontier. Paul rose, dusted off his hands, and looked toward the horizon. "Seems the frontier's got more secrets than we figured." Babe nudged him, encouraging him forward. With the mystery solved, or at least respected, Paul and Babe turned back toward the Great Lakes. But as they left the silent plain behind, Paul couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper had awakened in the land. Something ancient, watching, waiting. And the frontier, though calm, felt far from finished with them. The mystery of the sunken forest stayed with Paul long after he and Babe returned to the Great Lakes, though the land had closed itself again. Sealing away the glowing trees beneath its crust, Paul could still feel that deep heartbeat echoing through the soil. The frontier wasn't just alive, it was aware. It had watched him carve lakes, face storms, and reshape the wilderness. And now it had revealed that it, too, could move in ways no human or giant could fully understand. Paul didn't fear it, but he respected it more than ever. After a few days helping settlers repair their storm-battered homes, Paul and Babe headed west. Rumors had begun to spread of new lands that needed clearing, places where pioneers had traveled but found the terrain too treacherous to settle. Jagged hills, unpredictable ground, and strange formations that rose and fell overnight, like living sculptures. Paul scratched his beard as he listened to the stories. "Sounds like the land's acting up again," he said. "Maybe still shaken from that big storm." Babe mooed in agreement, trotting beside him as they set off toward the far horizon. The journey took them through thick forests, across rolling plains, and over the quiet edges of the Great Lakes. But as they moved westward, the terrain changed. The land grew rougher, uneven, almost restless. Rocks jutted from the earth like broken teeth. Valleys dipped unexpectedly. The wind carried a strange echo, not of trees rustling or water flowing, but something deeper, older. Paul slowed, placing a hand on the ground. It vibrated faintly, as though something beneath them was shifting. "Easy, Babe," he murmured. "We're walking on unsettled ground," they continued cautiously, but the deeper they went, the more the frontier behaved strangely. One night, as Paul lay on his back, looking at the stars, the ground beneath him rose an inch softly, subtly like the land was breathing. Babe jolted awake, snorting aggressively. "I felt it too," Paul whispered. By dawn, they discovered the source of the disturbance. The land was not merely rising. It was forming something. Ahead of them stretched a series of ridges, long, uneven, curling like the marks of a giant dragging his heels across the earth. Paul recognized the pattern instantly. They looked exactly like footprints, enormous footprints. Yet he knew they were not his. He approached cautiously. Each footprint was large enough for a small lake to sit inside. Some were deeper, as though a massive heel had pressed down with great weight. Others curved so sharply that even Paul had to climb to reach the middle. Babe sniffed one of the indentations and let out a startled chuff. Paul lowered into the print, running his hands along the edges. The soil had been compacted so tightly that even his enormous strength barely made a dent. This was no accident. Something huge had walked across this land, something powerful enough to reshape the terrain. But as Paul looked closer, he noticed something stranger still. The prints were not fresh. They were fossilized. The land had grown around them, hardened over time, as if preserving memory in stone. Not a creature, Paul whispered. A force. He felt the wind shift. Far off, dust began to rise slowly, steadily forming the faint outline of a shape. A silhouette taller than the clouds, walking with a slow, deliberate gait. Paul rose to his feet. "It's him," he said softly. The settlers in old legends sometimes spoke of a being called the Earthwalker, a giant spirit of the land. Older than mountains, older than rivers, older even than the soil itself. They said he walked only when the balance of nature was disturbed, carving valleys with a single step, raising hills with a tired sigh. And after the storm Paul had defeated, after the forest had sunk to protect itself, it made sense. The Earthwalker had stirred. The dust silhouette faded, leaving only silence behind. But the message was clear. "Frontier's changing, babe," Paul murmured. "We ain't just building on it anymore. We're sharing it with forces bigger than us." Babe nuzzled him, offering comfort. Paul stepped out of the deepest footprint. The earth shifted, not violently, but with purpose. The ground beneath that footprint began to rumble, then rise. Slowly at first, then faster. The indentation grew upward, solidifying, hardening, forming jagged edges and towering spires. Within minutes, the footprint became a mountain. Paul stumbled back, eyes wide. Every print, every step began to rise as well. The entire line of indentations lifted skyward, one after another, transforming into a chain of mountains, stretching across the horizon like the ribs of a colossal beast. The settlers watching from miles away would later swear they had witnessed the birth of an entire mountain range. Paul stood in awe. "So that's why the ground's been restless," he whispered. "The frontier's lifting itself up." Babe moved softly, as though understanding the weight of the moment. Paul placed his hand on the newly formed rock. It was warm, alive in its own ancient way. He felt no hostility from the mountains, only resilience. The storm had scarred the land, and now the land healed itself by rising stronger, and Paul knew he was no longer just shaping the frontier. He was learning from it. He looked across the newborn peaks, sharp, proud. "Guess we'll call these the Rockies," he said with a grin. Babe snorted approvingly. With mountains now guarding the western horizon and the Earthwalker's presence still lingering in the wind, Paul realized that the frontier had begun a new era, one where man, beast, and land all moved in response to one another. And though the Rockies now towered behind him, their shadows stretching across the plains, Paul felt no fear, only anticipation. For beyond those peaks lay the next story, the next challenge. The next wild frontier waiting for him and Babe to carve, protect, or simply understand. And Paul Bunyan, giant of the land, would walk toward it step by colossal step. The frontier had grown vast under the hands and hooves of Paul Bunyan and Babe the Blue Ox. Rivers had been redirected, lakes carved, forests reshaped, and mountains raised from mere footprints. Settlers built homes, planted crops, and grew towns that would one day become cities. And yet, the most remarkable creation of all was neither land nor water, but a story, a living, breathing legend that spanned the continent. Paul stood atop one of the newly formed mountains, gazing out over the lands he had helped shape. Babe rested beside him, enormous body coiled like a sleeping hill, blue coat glistening in the sunlight. They had seen storms, earthquakes, and strange mysteries of the land. They had witnessed forests hiding themselves, rivers flowing where none had before, and mountains rising as if from the memory of the earth itself. Yet what made Paul pause now wasn't he, a challenge of the earth, it was the weight of history. All of this, he murmured, voice carried by the wind, ain't just for the folks, now. It's for everyone yet to come. Babe nudged him gently, a reminder of the partnership that had made all of it possible. The settlers remembered back in Bunyansville. Settlers spoke in hushed reverence about the giant who carved their world. Parents told their children stories of Paul and Babe at night, warning them to respect the land but promising that heroes existed who could shape it with care and strength. Teachers, preachers, and travelers repeated tales of the Blue Ox and the Lumberjack, embellishing them with each retelling. With every story, the legend grew not as mere myth, but as a lesson. Paul wasn't just a man of enormous size. He was a symbol of courage, kindness, and determination. Babe wasn't merely an ox. He was loyalty, wisdom, and power tempered with gentleness. Together, they were more than flesh and bone, they were the embodiment of possibility itself. Paul often laughed when he overheard settlers discussing the details. Some said he was taller than a hill. Some said he could lift entire rivers in one hand. Some claimed he created the Great Lakes with a single swing of his axe. And while Paul knew the truth was somewhere in between, he didn't mind the exaggeration. Legends were meant to inspire, not merely to record. Passing into myth as years passed, Paul and Babe's travels became less about shaping the frontier and more about preserving it. They guided rivers to prevent floods, smoothed paths for settlers, and ensured forests thrived even in cleared lands. Mountains bore their footprints. Valleys carried their laughter. Each act left a mark that was both physical and spiritual, a reminder of their presence long after they moved on. Eventually, the two of them grew less visible. Settlers would speak of seeing distant blue flashes in the forest, or glimpsing a shadow so large it could only belong to Paul or Babe. Some mornings, children would wake to find footprints in the soil larger than any they had ever seen, leading deep into forests or across hills. Yet when adults investigated, there was nothing but the wind. The frontier itself seemed to remember them, protecting their legacy in subtle ways. Rivers continued to flow in paths they had guided. Trees leaned as though listening. Mountains rose tall and proud, following the patterns they had once stepped through. A friendship immortalized through it all. The bond between Paul and Babe never wavered. Generations of settlers could marvel at their feats, but only Paul and Babe truly understood the depth of their connection. One was the strength and mind of a giant. The other was the heart and endurance of a creature born of legend. Together, they could face storms, mysteries, and challenges that no human or animal could endure alone. Even as time moved forward and their presence became less tangible, the bond remained a symbol for the people. Courage and loyalty, tempered with care and compassion, could shape not only the land but also the spirit of everyone who lived upon it. The final chapter, never really final. One sunset, Paul and Babe stood on a cliff, overlooking the horizon where the land met the sky. The Great Lakes shimmered below them. Forests whispered in the evening wind. Mountains cast shadows that stretched for miles. Paul's axe rested across his shoulder, not because he needed it, but because it was part of who he was. Babe nuzzled him, blue coat reflecting gold light. "Think they'll remember us?" Paul asked softly. Babe mooed, a sound that carried across the valleys, deep and resonant. "Yes," Paul replied, smiling. "Long after we're gone, they'll still remember, because legends once born never truly die." Paul and Babe had left their mark, not only on the land, but on the hearts and imaginations of everyone who called the frontier home. Every mountain, lake, and forest bore the echo of their footsteps. Every story told by a parent, every map marked with a lake, every whisper of the wind carried their memory forward. Even as the world changed, the legend endured. Generations would come to hear of the giant who shaped rivers, the blue ox who followed loyally, and the friendship that could bend the wilderness itself. And in the quiet corners of the frontier where rivers bend, forests deepen, and mountains rise, some swore they could still feel the pulse of the giant and the blue ox, walking together, ever vigilant, ever strong. Paul Bunyan and Babe the Blue Ox had become more than figures in a story. They had become immortality itself, and thus their tale was eternal.